All right, go ahead and log on iClicker. It might be that thing where 10 minutes in, it won't let you claim attendance anymore. We're not going to use it much today, but I do want to get a feel for who's able to get on and who's not. I'll probably have to go through the one on there. Anybody try to follow the link that I put up of the Zoom lecture? That's my feelings. If you do and you find it doesn't work or requires a passcode that's not working, please let me know. Zoom is really tedious like that, but I think it works for me as a link, but sometimes that's not the same as it working for the students. Was Tyler here? We don't have Tyler, and is Brianna here? Brianna is here. Okay. Trying to remember names, but okay. Couple of updates before we get started. We're going to try to move relatively quickly through the rest of the biomes lecture. Following that, we have kind of aquatic biomes lecture. I badmouth this is kind of high school ecology. Just say that not because it's not, it may or may not be interesting to you, but it's not the conceptual stuff that's college ecology usually is, but it'll set a good framework. Announcements, get on iClicker as soon as possible. Starting next week, that will be required to get attendance and participation points. I have commented on almost all of the first week's Canvas posts, and I even commented online on some of them and pointed out their strengths and weaknesses. I have individually responded to a bunch of you, kind of saying, this is a good start, and as promised, you'll get a 10 out of 10, but this would not get you as many points as I would like you to have and you would like to have in future weeks. And pretty much across the board, it's just you haven't, we got to get you in the habit of taking this further. So don't just restate. It's kind of normal to have a sentence or two be restating what's going on. Like, what do I want to talk about? I want to talk about the levels of ecology, or I want to talk about thermoregulation. And by the way, you don't have to talk about exactly what we're talking about right now, but please make it in the last 2 weeks, let's say. In other words, a month from now, don't talk about biomes. Talk about what we're trying to understand in the current lecture material. But the main thing is that, so you restate it, we're talking about the levels of ecology, and if you don't take it much further, then we're talking about the levels of ecology, and he gave an example like Russ, then I call that an informational post. A polite way of putting, you just said kind of what I already said, and while it's genius, it's not what I want to see from you. I want to see you thinking. Even if you get confused, think on the page. Use your stuff going on at your job, or the stuff you saw on a hike in Flagstaff, or the stuff you saw, the ducks at the pond. use your personal experience, the stuff that sticks in your brain easily, use it to try to understand the schema that we're working with here. A lot of times people will go seek out articles, and that's fine. It's not really necessary. I'd rather hear you ripping on your own experience than saying, well, I think you'll be impressed if I go find something on population genetics of mice. If that's what you want to do to kind of create a topic for us, that's fine. Or you can use the topics in your experience or the topics that we're talking about in the classroom. The point is, do you take it deeper than that? Do you try to gain some insight by comparing what you think is the population ecology of this organism with what also might be the community ecology? It's fine if you get a little confused or even if you kind of misstate things. That's not going to lose you a lot of points. Just do a lot of thinking on the page. Doesn't have to be super long, but if it's super short, you can't get much done except saying we're talking about levels of ecology. See you next week. So with that being said, I hope that you'll redouble your efforts and really try to get all those points. That said, Canvas discussion in this form is really a product of this class having gotten so big that I can't grade them all, but I can grade all of these. And so what I find is I don't want to give you an assignment that it's kind of a vague assignment. I'll grant you that. But when I have 90 people, what I need to do is say, well, this is this course material. Take the vague assignment of talking about the course material and trying to draw insights from it. But I've only got 12, 10 in this class right now. And so I would like to tweak the Canvas discussion board a little bit. As promised, I'm messing with the syllabus. And I'm going to tweak it in this way. You're going to get this 10 points from this first week. I'm going to start creating more formal assignments for you to do on Canvas. For example, the first one starting next week, and I'll post this in the next couple of days, is I'm going to give you a link to the website of a journal called Global Change Biology. And I'm going to ask you to seek out an abstract from that journal and tell us in your own words, what the hell did they just say in this abstract? Because sometimes it's going to be very complicated, but you can figure it out. And you're going to point out at least 2 levels of ecology going on just from the abstract. You don't have to read the whole paper. You can if it's really interesting to you. But I'm going to challenge you to get into the primary literature and see how it's ecological. See how they were talking about the physiology of the grasshoppers, and they were talking about the explosive population growth of the grasshoppers. Boom, I've got individual and population ecology working together. So I'm going to do that, and that's only going to come around every 2 weeks or so. It's not going to be a weekly thing, and you'll always get a prescribed assignment. It will be explained, and generally they will be worth 20 points rather than 10 points. And there won't be responding to people. No matter how hard I try, people really struggle with responding to people. Dude, this is cool what you said here. It's hard for people to know what to say about other people's posts. So you won't be responding to other people's posts, but for 20 points, another 7 times in the semester, you will be given a specific assignment. You're still going to have to think out loud, but it's going to be specific. You're going to be going to a website, or you're going to be watching a video, or you're going to be, maybe it'll just be something I talk about in lecture and say, I want to hear people's thoughts on this. So regarding that lecture, answer these questions, or tell us what you think about whether it's humane to talk about overpopulation. So you'll have specific Canvas assignments, not the vague nebulous thing, tell us what you're thinking right now. They'll generally be worth 20 points instead of 10, and you won't be responding to people. The only drawback to that is that it's not a regular thing that you're used to every week, but you will be getting reminders from me every Tuesday. When one's due a week later, you'll have at least 7 days notice to do it, and I'll be reminding you throughout that whole week. So hopefully you don't forget, because it will be worth 20 points instead of 10. Okay, I think the lower frequency and the more specific assignment, I think will go better. We'll see how it goes. Okay, look at that, we got 11 people. Oh, maybe I'm one of them. Am I on there? Am I the 11th person? It's like, is there a ghost? This is too freaky. Who is on there? It's not in this room. Maybe they'll help me remember names. So Alexander and Erica. That. Okay. That's confusing. Ah, Tyler is not here, right? Tyler is off in the Netherlands. Well, we'll have to talk to Tyler because I haven't seen much of him. All right. So we are recording. I'm going to try to keep up the habit of publishing those for you. We left off talking about tropical rainforests. We came to the conclusion, hopefully, let me share this. We came to the conclusion, or I told you, let's come to the conclusion that tropical rainforests have very poor soil. And so it's kind of the neat idea that too much of a good thing is not actually good. Too much rain, too much moisture, too much decomposition, it all just goes away too fast. And we're going to contrast that here in a bit with a rainforest and temperate forests where there's a nice combination of conditions. So poor soils in tropical rainforests. We talked about this a little bit. The biology of tropical rainforests is really cool and fun. And if you weren't born in one or haven't been to one, see if you can get a trip somehow. My first sabbatical here, I got the department to help pay for me to go to the Peruvian Amazon. I saw some of the biggest spiders and craziest things. I saw a sloth in the bottom of a human pit toilet eating poop covered toilet paper. That was the source of bad dreams for a while. The crazy thing about biology of tropical rainforests is how diverse it is. So you've got this open understory, you've got these big trees, it's nice and cool, it's really humid, you're dying, but you're not in the sun. This tall canopy, largely evergreen trees, meaning they don't all drop their leaves. And that's because of the constancy of the climate. There's not an on-off deciduous kind of adaptation here. It's all the time. The crazy thing about the tropical rainforest is how many species live there. So in a temperate rainforest, think the Smokies or outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, you might find 30 species in 1 hectare in the forest, 30 species, which is total BS because we don't know half the insects and there's definitely more species there than we think. But if you compare in the similar size tropical rainforest, you'll get 10 times that species diversity. Sometimes you can go up to a tree and the tree alone has more than 1,000 species. And again, we just don't know most of the arthropod species. And so we're way underestimating this. The species diversity, the community ecology of the tropical rainforest is just out of this world. And I told you we don't totally know why, but the most accepted hypothesis is that probably the climate started the ball rolling. The climate, the day length, the same reason that we have a lot of migratory birds that go back that direction. The climate favored a lot of species, and then species beget species. Like if you're a new parent, you find out, oh, actually, when they sleep more, they actually sleep even more. If you have species, you get more species. And that's because when species get into complex, really tight-knit relationships, that's the species interaction course of the course, whether it's parasitism or predation or mutualism, those relationships, they're not always good for one species or the other, but they tend to put selection pressure on a species and species change. That natural selection of having a parasitoid that is just killing your population is strong natural selection for you to change. So that you might get speciation where the original species is still getting hammered, but you have a new species, doesn't happen overnight, know anything about speciation or genetic variation, you know that it takes a while to kind of make two gene pools so separate that we can call them different species. And I don't know what species concept you use, but I use the biological species concept, which is the one that says two species are two groups that can't interbreed. In other words, if it's two groups, and if you brought them together and they could make babies, then it's actually still the same species. A lot of people talk about cryptic species now, and that's the idea that actually you have a group that looks like they all make babies together, but they don't. Speciation tends to happen when you have different species pressing on each other in different ways, eating each other, stealing each other's resources. That leads to more speciation over a great time. And the idea is that the tropical rainforest has that, and it has led to some amazing adaptations. This is the snapjaw ant, one of my favorite. You can go online and see a video of how when a predator threatens the snapjaw ant, he snaps his jaws together and he can flip like, well, it's the equivalent. If they were people, they would be leaping 44 feet high in the air and 132 length. So they have an amazing adaptation to allow them to avoid predation. Tropical rainforests have been decimated by human beings. When I was a kid in elementary school in the 80s, like everybody had a chapter, had a segments in school on the rainforest. Even though I was growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, and never been to a rainforest, we heard about the rainforest. Save the rainforest. You know, big banners, big TV commercials. And then all of a sudden it got very quiet. And it's not because the rainforest got saved, it's because people got busy or people gave up hope. The tropical rainforest still needs to be saved. It is being massively claimed by deforestation. If you go to the Amazon, you're putting along in a little boat, you will get passed by massive, largely Asian tankers just covered, loaded with logs. They are cutting down trees faster than they can make money. So that's kind of a greedy angle to things, and I'm certainly not for corporations making money and taking away our biodiversity, but we have to remember that there is a level of reasonableness to this. People live there and they have to make money, and they live somewhere where lots of people want to come and be tourists. They live in a place that lots of people come and want their resources. They're doing the best they can to survive. And so we just have to do the cost benefit analysis. If we just had the exploitation that comes from subsistence, then we'd be fine. It's this massive scale deforestation that only comes about when big companies can do big damage that we run into problems. If you come up with an idea how to convince companies to stop trying to make money on deforestation, let me know what it is. So we're moving now away from the equator to tropical dry forest. Okay, it's still tropical, still in between 0 and 30 degrees, north and south of the equator. Here's an example. Bombay has got a new name. I can't remember what it is, but it's not called that anymore. But compare it to a tropical rainforest climate diagram. What you see is that the temperature hasn't changed that much. It's maybe not exactly the flat line that it used to be, but you don't have a big summer temperature. You still have all 12 months below freezing, but now you have seasonality and precipitation. So if you got a quiz question, which is more variable in the tropical dry forest relative to the tropical rainforest, you would pick precipitation. Look at this rainy season, massively rainy, couple months of the year, and then it's dropped. More seasonal precipitation. There's a pronounced dry season, still very low variation in temperature. Pretty much everything I just said. That's the quiz question that I just posed to you. The neat thing, and the reason that tropical dry forests are actually in more trouble than tropical rainforest, is that you can actually make a living off of producing food there. The soil is much richer in tropical dry forest than tropical rainforest because of this variation. And this is a neat, I think, a neat theme in ecology. Things are always better when there's variation. You've maybe heard this argument made by liberal politicians or ASU's President Michael Crow. We do better when we have many, many different types. And it's true in nature as well. farm productivity. The soil is more productive when you have lots of different types of climate. When you have a rainy season and a dry season. Of course, here you don't have a lot of difference in temperature, but warm temperatures are good for growing stuff. What you need is not to be waterlogged. And the tropical dry forest has that. The decomposition rate is not nearly as low, so the soil actually stays richer and you can grow stuff there. If you knock down all the trees, which people do in tropical dry forests as well, go to Costa Rica. It's an amazing country, but man, are they cutting down the trees for banana plantations. When you cut down the trees, you do sacrifice that soil quality. The soil starts to erode because it doesn't have the tree canopy to protect it. The seasonality leads to some amazing adaptations, including in the plant life, the feature of deciduous trees. Trees that lose their leaves in the dry season, in the off season, in the winter, if you will. That is an adaptation that arrives from the natural selection of seasonality. You don't see that nearly as much in tropical rainforests where there's no seasonality in temperature or rain. So the soil is better, and that means it's more fertile soil, and that then means that more people try to live there. More people try to live there, more people try to make money deforesting the area, and so you do have threats to the soil. So in a lot of ways, people worry about tropical dry forest more than they worry about tropical rainforest. Okay, tropical savanna is our third biome, and it's kind of a weird one because geographically, it's not that different from tropical dry forest. It's still in the tropics or the subtropics, we might call it, but it's not moved into the 30-degree realm where most deserts are. It is totally different looking though. This does not look like a tropical dry forest. This hardly looks like a forest. This looks like a scene out of, you know, a Disney movie about the African safari. So what makes a tropical savanna a savanna, which is just kind of a grassland with trees peppered throughout? What makes that a savanna instead of a forest? It has a very similar climate. It's noteworthy that fire comes along and does a lot of work on the soil of tropical savanna, but the main difference is its soil. Why is the soil different in the tropical savanna? It's because of the nature of the soil. The soil doesn't take water as well as a tropical dry forest. The soil is very desert-like. It's impermeable. We have such flooding here, both because of the intense monsoons and because, well, we've put down so much concrete. Concrete's the ultimate impermeable surface, right? It can't go anywhere until it hits a drain. So it just runs, and it runs and gets collected, and then next thing you know, your neighbor's $1 million in the hole because their house got flooded. This soil is not good and sucking. It doesn't suck the water down. It just lets the water run right off of it. It does retain enough water, if it's left alone, to keep the desert out. It's not that bad. We'll get to desert next. And it is so waterlogged, especially in low-lying places, that it keeps the forest out. So you don't get forest because the water doesn't soak down. It just stays waterlogged in the wet season. But you don't get desert because it's relatively dry and retains enough water to not lead to more desert plant life. So the result is you get something in between a desert and a forest, and that is a grassland with some trees here and there. These trees show up in the nicely drained areas. The areas that don't stay wet are the places that you get these trees, but it's largely a grassland. Totally different playing field ecosystem from a forest. It's got some neat biology. So you have the combination of grassland and trees. We talked about fire being important. It's dry enough that when fire does come, naturally, say from lightning strikes, not naturally, say from human activity, it's a destructive force, and we think about the destruction of fire. But fire, when it's not suppressed and when there's not human lives at stake, is actually good for an ecosystem. It actually regenerates the soil. In some forests that, like for example, pine cones won't provide seed unless they are cracked open by intense heat. The really neat thing about this grassland area and the fact that there's seasonality in rain is that it leads animals to have to migrate. So if you've heard about the big, great African migration, if you've seen movies where somebody's getting killed by a water hole, that's all driven by the tropical savanna biome, where only low-lying areas retain water. And then things get very dry in the dry season, animals are dying, and then all of a sudden they get hit by that rainy season, and they all go to the place where water pools up. And if that's not enough reason to like it, it's actually most likely to be the birthplace of modern Homo sapiens. Humans can beat the bejeebers out of it, just like any ecosystem. This is very susceptible to livestock grazing. In other words, a grassland is like free grazing, especially in countries that don't regulate that sort of thing very well. But as soon as you graze year after year after year, attacked by a fly, the soil starts to suffer. The soil starts to no longer retain enough water to stay a grassland. You take that grass away from a grassland, all of a sudden that soil is getting hit hard. There's no structure to retain water. There's no roots, grass roots to help retain water. And what you get is a desert. So you can use the fancy word desertification. This is something that as droughts continue, we are worried about neighboring ecosystems being shifted to desert. Not that there's anything wrong with a desert, except that we don't want to be affecting plant life in ways that eliminate other ecosystems. All right, that's the end of part 1 of the Biomes lecture. The remainder takes off where we left off at grasslands, savanna, and moves to the desert. So we've talked about deserts already. Day 1 or so, we talked about deserts because we live in one. You know that they occur at bands at 30 degrees north and south. You know that's largely because of the combination of the Hadley and Farrell cells. You also know that the rain shadow effect can lead to a dry ecosystem. The rain shadow coming over the Sierra Nevada provides us with winds that suck up, dry winds that suck up all the moisture. An even better illustration of this is the Atacama Desert, the driest ecosystem in the world. It's 100 times more arid than Death Valley. And that comes about right here, both because of its latitude, but mainly because of a double whammy, a double rain shadow. So you have a mountain range here where coastal winds come up, go over and suck all the moisture out of the desert here. But then you also have winds coming over this mountain range. So getting it from both directions, dry air is coming at you into this little desert valley known as the Atacama Desert. The rain shadows can have a big influence on where deserts occur. The main trend, we talked about this already as well, is that evaporation is much lower than, precipitation is outdone by temperature. So you always see in deserts this red line above this blue line. In most deserts, you have this 12-month temperature above freezing. That can be different in some unique deserts like this one in Mongolia, where there's more seasonality. Soils in deserts, not famously great. Deserts get a bad rap as being like lifeless zones, and I think anyone that's spent any time in the Sonoran Desert knows that's not true, but it is true that they have relatively low productivity. Productivity is an ecosystem term. It's short for primary productivity. This is the transfer of energy. So photosynthetic energy ignition, turning that into plants, turning that into herbivory, turning that into predators that can eat herbivores. That primary productivity is very low in an area that gets this little water. It leads to plant life that don't even have leaves, right? That's one of the main features that we'll see in the biology is here, is that we don't have the the productivity that leads to deciduous trees dropping leaves everywhere. So the soils really do suffer. They can become rocky, especially as we overuse water. They can become, they can lose their nutrients. They can just become salty and very even worse in terms of productivity. And it leads to a neat little conundrum. We saw soil quality was bad at the equator because there was too much water. We see that soil quality was good in the temperate or the tropical dry forests because there was a moderate amount of water. And now we're to the place in deserts where there's too little water. And again, the soils are bad. So it's one of the, it lives up to that dictum, everything in moderation. Here's some examples of the biology of a desert. Largely leafless or rapidly deciduous trees and shrubs, not leaving a lot for the soil to grow from. It nevertheless has seed banks that can last years and years and years. You've heard of the desert bloom. Ooh, should we expect much of a desert bloom this year? And that totally depends on rainfall. That totally depends on how the winter went. Was there more rain than we expect? Should we expect a big desert bloom? Humans now live in the desert. You could make a case that it's a crazy thing. There's a lot of talk in the news right now about water availability and the allotment of Colorado River water. I think it's going to be a major issue. There's a lot of elections going on now. People are talking about water in the future. Almost certainly, we're overusing water. We probably have too many people living in the desert. We're probably shouldn't be running misters at Starbucks. I know that's not water that anyone drinks, but it is water use. Overusing water just increases the desert. It increases, it makes desertification. It makes for a desert creep. That makes desert soils less productive. That makes the whole ecosystem more arid. And that means that we might be able to live here because we're supplementing water for however long, we don't know, but it makes it harder for other organisms to live here. It's a really interesting question to say what can live in the city in a desert and what can live in the desert of a desert. It's a field of urban ecology that I'm involved in a little bit. And we have a focus group, a grant that asks what is going on in the city of Phoenix versus the Sonoran Desert. Why do we have the animals in the city that we don't have in the desert? What desert animals do we not have in the city? That question of the ecology of a desert city is an active one, especially in this area. Okay, this is a fun biome. Everybody likes to visit. I'm always raving about San Diego. Mediterranean woodland and shrubland. This is no longer a shift of latitude, but it's a move towards coastal areas. So the key to a Mediterranean woodland or shrubland is that you are Mediterranean, is that you are coastal. So you're found near marine environments. We're now outside of the tropics. We've moved out of 30 degrees latitude. Deserts are inland. We're now moving towards temperate latitudes, not yet to 60 degrees, but outside of the tropics. And we find these unique Mediterranean coastal ecosystems, which are very popular because their climate is quite nice. For one, you can grow things there year round, right? I check the weather in San Diego a lot, and it's like always 74 degrees. It's rarely freezing, if ever. You do have the seasonal precipitation that we talked about is necessary for a lot of plant life. You also have a seasonal temperature, a seasonal variation in temperature, but it's pretty moderate, right? This is in Italy. It looks like they get up to 30, but only in the middle of the summer. You are differing from the tropical environments in having more pronounced temperature fluctuations. Yes, this red line is peaking a little bit more than the red line was flat in the tropical, and that's largely due to latitude. Latitude, question mark, you can scratch out the question mark, that's due to latitude. But this is not an extreme environment. It's a pretty moderate ecosystem, and that is because of its location in coastal areas. We talked about the maritime or moderating effect, the fact that when you're near big bodies of water, you don't heat up as fast and you don't cool off as fast, so you stay more moderate. Fire also has been an important driver of soil health in these ecosystems. The soil can get a little iffy, but it's actually a place where a lot of people make a lot of money with vineyards, because vineyards, grapes don't need quite the soil quality that a lot of plants do. Fire historically burned that and kind of regenerated and made it even healthier, but we now suppress fire because there's people, lots of people, and lots of million-dollar homes. Fire is even more, so we suppress fire, and that actually makes fire more damaging. The fires that are happening now are almost certainly the product of us suppressing fire, but also the product of weather patterns becoming more extreme. When we do get fire now, since it's been suppressed so long, it's more intense and it's actually more damaging for soils. So fire is another thing that is kind of like precipitation in that it's healthier in moderate doses. Fire we used to get historically was beneficial. The fire we get now that we've been suppressing fire can be too intense and actually damage soils. There's a lot of trees and shrubs that dominate the Mediterranean woodland and shrubland. They tend to be kind of hardy. I mean, if you look at this trunk, you can imagine that it could actually survive some fire. So a lot of natural selection from the historical fires in this area. These tend to be shrubs and not big trees. They do well in this cool, moderate, and moist environment. Because it's such a nice place to live, it's very populated, heavily populated. The soil we talked about is fragile, especially with fire suppression, but it is generally a pretty populous area or ecosystem. So again, not moving too far away latitudinally, but instead kind of going from the Mediterranean woodland and going inland, we run into temperate grasslands. Got some examples here in Kansas and China. There's a huge continental distribution of this. You see this band, both north and south, of temperate grasslands. Okay, so we had the more tropical savanna, which was grassland-like. Now we're talking about a temperate grassland, so we're further away from the equator. You can see the temperature variation is much greater. If you've lived in the Midwest, you know it's a pretty tough winter. It's a pretty cold winter, and you can't grow stuff there in the winter. Farmers take half the year off. But remember what we talked about, how that's actually really beneficial for soil. So it's going to turn out that temperate grasslands have the best soil, the best growing conditions anywhere in the world. This is where all of our food comes from. And so we need to take care of temperate grasslands because they are producing most of our food. And they're doing so because of the climate. And they're doing so because it's a temperate ecosystem where you have a winter, you have changes, you have fluctuation in precipitation that kind of mirrors the fluctuation in temperature. So you have a growing season. Growing season peak coincides with peak precipitation. The soils are amazing, at least for the time being. Very rich soils, very productive ecosystems, both when we leave them alone and of course, when we boost them with chemicals and fertilizers, they become even more productive. But if you have any intuition on these things, that can be too much. You can overboost with fertilizers. You can exhaust soils by providing them with too much surplus nutrient. So you get this herbaceous vegetation. If you've ever been to the Midwest, they do have natural grasslands. It's mostly farms, but there are a couple of areas that have actually gone out of their way to preserve the prairie. Fires, again, very important. And in this type of ecosystem, much like in Africa and the tropical savanna, you get large herbivores, large animals that roam and will migrate and are eating up all that vegetation. You might think of traditionally the buffalo, as well as pronghorn. These are migratory grazers that live in the temperate grassland. So we are really working these ecosystems over. It is where we rely on food production. And for that reason, it's our own most threatened ecosystem. Because of nutrient loss from the soil, erosion, using fertilizers, using chemicals, agriculture has not caught up with the sustainability movement, if you will. And most farms are not family farms. They're not small farms anymore. There's great work showing that small family farms are very sustainable. And as soon as they become big, they start mass producing and it becomes less of a sustainable enterprise. All right, temperate forests, that's where I grew up. We're talking roughly 60 degrees latitude now. These can be more coastal than the interior temperate grasslands. So you get some neat things going on here. So this is Philadelphia. You can see how it's a little bit like a temperate grassland in that there's a growing season. You have precipitation kind of all over the place, but it's more coastal, and so you get more kind of random effects. And then you can have a temperate forest like the Pacific Northwest, and you get very different ecosystems here. We call these both temperate forests, but they're actually made up of completely different plants because of the differences in precipitation. In forests where the precipitation is pretty constant, you get deciduous forests, you get oak trees, you get poplars, you get things that lose their leaves. They lose their leaves when in the off season, in the non-growing season, when it gets cold. But you get a very different temperate forest when you have this kind of crazy variation, when you have a dry season. This dry season, you'll see, overlaps with the warmest months. So that's kind of a tricky thing, that the higher elevation, you see that here, higher elevation temperate forests have to deal with kind of craziness in their precipitation patterns. And conifers, pines, firs, they deal with this drought in the growing season better than a tree that has a big leaf and needs all that water. So you tend to find coniferous forests where there's a lot of variation in precipitation, which comes largely from elevation. And you tend to find deciduous forests, deciduous temperate forests, when there's a predictable precipitation pattern, and coniferous temperate forests when there's a dry spell right in the middle of the summer. Okay, so again, you're selecting for trees losing their leaves when there's a winter, a normal winter, normal as I think of winter. But these are amazingly fertile soils because, especially the ones that are temperate forests that have deciduous trees, there's like millions of dollars are made every year. Everybody in Atlanta that is bored drives up to the Smokies to see the colors in October. That change of colors is a sign of the productivity to come, the organic material that's about to be dumped with those leaves being dropped is really, really healthy for the soil. And you get to play in the leaves. The biology is dominated, same as a tropical rainforest, by the tall trees. So you have the overstory, the tree canopy, which then makes life underneath it shaded and different for both incoming plants and animals. It is home to the biggest organism on the planet, General Sherman. Pretty worth the drive if you go up that way. 274 feet tall, 102 feet around. Hard to conceive of. Temperate forests are popular places to live. They have trees that make a lot of people some money, and they have mountains which are prone to mineral extraction. Nothing more horrifying The only thing more horrifying than cutting down a forest is lopping the top off of a mountain. Mountaintop removal is one of the most devastating ecosystem damages that can be done. Hard to be a mountain when you don't have a top. But there's stuff in there that can make people rich. All right, we got two more. We're going up north. The last two are only in the northern hemisphere. If you're wondering why we don't cover Antarctica, you can talk to Becky Ball. A lot of people talk about Antarctica as a polar desert, but it's really off the charts. Nobody knows quite what to do with Antarctica. It's kind of a host of it into its own. But up north, we have two more extreme biomes that we'll talk about. First, the boreal forest, and you can see we're way up there. And it's a consistent band across the north, across the northern hemisphere. The boreal forest, you're probably guessing it's cold because of its latitude, and it is, but it does have some seasonality. You look at that. It has a couple of months where it's not freezing. 3-4 months of summer. Umeå, Sweden's another one. The photo period is really weird up here as well, as you might guess, being so far north. This is in Canada. Long, cold winters. That means there's not a lot of the 12 months of the year for plants to grow. Precipitation is pretty good, but it's so cool that it doesn't tend to evaporate. So there's actually plenty of precipitation for the soil because the temperatures are so cold. The problem is that there's not much soil to grow on. Soils here are very sparse in their nutrients. They can become salty, they can become acidic. Decomposition is like glacial. So you don't really think of boreal forests as incredibly diverse ecosystems. And that's largely because their biology is dominated by the trees that make up the forest. And those trees tend to be like one species sometimes. These conifers can dominate an entire ecosystem. They have neat little soil relationships with fungi, but you don't have a lot of herbaceous vegetation, the kind of things that you might think of like a deer eating. You don't have that. You typically have a monoculture of pine. Nevertheless, humans have gotten up there and done some damage. There used to be big grazers roaming that area, and we've made coats out of them. We have overhunted the boreal forest, and trees are trees. People will get up there and knock down trees as well to cash in. Last but not least is the tundra. This is a ring around the northern hemisphere, above the Arctic Circle. Home of Santa Claus and a reindeer. You're probably guessing it's cold, but it's actually not as cold in the winter as the boreal forest, and that's a maritime or moderating effect. So the winter temperatures are actually less severe than the boreal forest. You do see some seasonality, but again, only 2, 3, maybe 4 months where you're above freezing. So cold that actually the soil doesn't ever thaw completely, at least normally. Temperatures here are, here, this is where we're talking about glaciers melting. Temperatures here, when it gets warm here, all hell breaks loose. Ice breaks off and floats away. The soil, the subsoil, is used to never thawing out. So the things that grow there have to be very shallow rooted. But now, more and more of that subsoil is thawing in the warm season. And you can actually get this crazy thing, I think this is in the next slide, called solifluction, where the soil just breaks off down at some level and slides away. So you've got like peat moss and kind of, some organic material here that's locked up, but it just becomes compacted into this area. When it thaws, it doesn't have any roots of soil to stay there, and it just goes away. So climate change is not friendly to the tundra or polar areas. There's some pretty little plants that grow there. not a lot for any big herbivore to take. But because there are waterways, and because the activity because there's so little time, you can actually find a decent amount of activity, insects, birds, a limited number of mammals. The Arctic fox, we're actually going to study a little bit of the Arctic fox and its habituation or acclimation to extreme temperatures. There's a decent diversity of organisms that have found ways to adapt to the extreme temperatures of the tundra and live in the tundra. How do we hurt this ecosystem? Well, global pollution is kind of a very susceptible area up at the poles, and also minerals that can be taken from these mountains have been extracted. It's a very vulnerable ecosystem. It's not one where a lot of humans live, but it's nevertheless one where lots of companies are doing business. So we've gone over, I don't remember how many, 8 biomes. Should we try to remember them? Tropical forest, tropical rainforest, tropical dry forest, tropical, I don't say tropical grassland, but what do we call it? We call it savanna. Tell me if I missed one. Desert, Mediterranean woodland shrubland, temperate forest, we forgot temperate grassland, then temperate forest, that gets to 7, and then boreal forest and the tundra, 9. Hopefully I didn't leave anybody out. Okay, so what are you going to do with all that? I've given you seriously a 45 seconds introduction to them. How are the big things different? How are tropical biomes different from temperate biomes? How are the tropical biomes similar? How do they differ? Again, how are tropical and temperate biomes similar or different? How are the temperate biomes, the grasslands, the Mediterranean woodlands, the temperate forest, how do these 3 things differ? Even when you can go within one, and for example, we pointed out differences, variation. Variation is the interesting stuff in the world, in biology especially. What's going on with variance within temperate forests? Why is there a conifer forest in Oregon and a deciduous forest in Pennsylvania? When we get more extreme, how are these temperate forests different from the extreme boreal forests? And then, of course, because we live there, we want to know what makes us so special. What are the things that are particularly vulnerable about deserts, like where we live? What is urbanization doing to a desert? How is that different from what urbanization does to Baltimore, Maryland, or Minneapolis, St. Paul? These are the kinds of comparative questions I hope that you will be thinking about. Certainly, there's enough information in there to try to memorize some of it, but I'm more interested in your ability to work with the general trends and talk about the big differences, the big commonalities, and the big differences among biomes. All right, give me 1 second, and we will start talking about water. I think everybody in here was in agreement that water is good. You all wanted to go to the mountain and find water. So what we're doing now is just shifting to aquatic environments. That was a review of terrestrial biomes. This is a quick review of aquatic environments. Pretty straightforward. We could break it into 2, saltwater and freshwater, marine habitats versus freshwater habitats. These still have chemical properties that drive them, the same way that we talked about how the climate is driven by precipitation and by temperature. Aquatic environments are less influenced by temperature and precipitation, largely because of, think about this maritime effect, it's buffered. The temperature of aquatic environments is not as variable as the temperature of terrestrial environments. Now, there'll be some exceptions to that, and later we'll talk about, what's a tropical lake like versus a temperate lake? But in general, we're going to talk less about temperature. We'll talk a little bit about sunlight, because some aquatic environments are shallow and therefore light gets through, and so you have photosynthesis. But it becomes really creepy and fun when we talk about many of the aquatic environments that are so dark and deep that there's no light, and who's living down there in the dark? Some pretty cool guys. So obviously water is important, and the chemical properties of water is important. Here are some, in my mind, boring facts about water that do drive aquatic environments. First of all, the maritime effect. It heats and cools more slowly. It is denser than air. I think it's densest at 4 degrees Celsius, and it is a good conductor of heat. It will absorb light, but it can take that heat and be less responsive to it, conduct it rather than absorb it. We do have to think about things in water like pressure goes up as we go deeper. Temperature is going to go down because there's going to be less sunlight peeking through. There will be, especially in lakes, small stagnant bodies of water, there's stratification. It's warmer, and then maybe you felt this when you're in a lake, there's like patches of warm and cold, especially if you dive deep in a lake. It gets colder a lot faster. And this is partly because of light availability, and that then affects both temperature and productivity. Primary productivity, this ecosystem principle, is completely dependent on photosynthesis, although there are some areas where there's chemically derived synthetic or organic materials, but in large part, we're reliant on plants to capture the sun's energy and get us started in the direction of sugars and nutrients. So these physical factors apply in aquatic ecosystems, and they're going to drive aquatic ecosystems as well. Water moves. We know about waves and currents and tides. Most simply, the fact that water goes downhill is an important one to the water structure of water in our ecosystems, and it also evaporates based on temperature. One thing that we don't think, maybe is not that intuitive, is that the fact that there are ocean currents actually affects how productive ecosystems can be. So you've got offshore winds, and they pull water away from the shore. That then allows water to move up from below. And interestingly, that upwelling actually brings nutrients up to the surface in the form of phytoplankton. So without that movement, the currents bringing water in and then bringing water off, you wouldn't have nearly the productive coastal aquatic ecosystems. And that's where you do find most aquatic primary productivity, is near the coast, both because of photosynthesis and because of this upwelling of nutrients. When we get out into the distant areas offshore, you have much less life, both marine life. Waves and tides are movements of the water that really help make some of the most diverse ecosystems. Kelp forests and coral reefs are a complete product of waves and the tides. I mean, if you've ever done any tide pooling, you know you go at the right time so that reef or kelp forest is exposed and you can see all the great stuff there. But remember this principle of how variation is important. These areas that have both terrestrial and aquatic phases all within a single month, kind of predictable phases, are incredibly diverse ecosystems. You can think of it as a terrestrial ecosystem and an aquatic ecosystem all at the same time. And so you have natural selection from that periodicity, and you get amazing biodiversity because of this water movement. This is the global hydrological society cycle. And I won't weigh you down with a lot of questions memorizing, like, how much of the earth is water. But I think it's really neat to point out that it's mainly ocean, right? 97% of our water is marine environment, is ocean. And those streams that myself and everybody was saying were like, their lifeblood, like what makes them happy, 1% of the water is fresh water. We're about to get more of it because this polar ice is leaving the solid form and it's going to increase slightly the fresh water. But there is a water table, there is a water cycle, global hydrologic cycle that needs to be considered when we think about how this water is completely, we are reliant on this water for our lives. Okay, so when we talk about aquatic systems, we'll ask a number of questions. Where are they located? Right, the geography of the aquatic system, the same way we talked about biomes. We'll talk about the physical factors associated with the environment. Is it shallow enough to receive sunlight? Is it deep enough to be cold? Is it deep enough to be dark? Pressure as well. What are the physical factors driving those environments? And what kinds of problems, oxygen levels, temperature levels, what kind of problems do those environments pose for their biota? So here's our roadmap. We're going to talk about a number of marine aquatic systems, starting with the ocean. And we're going to break it into the big open ocean way out offshore. And we're going to come in and talk about the neritic region, which is kind of the offshore ecosystem, much closer to the coast, where you find coral reefs, et cetera. And then we'll talk about the boundary waters, areas that are somewhat terrestrial, but do have a marine ecosystem element. The intertidal we just talked about, salt marshes and mangroves. These are largely variable based on the nature of the boundary that they're, what am I trying to say? Actually can't remember. There's some interesting difference that I'm blanking on between salt marshes and mangroves, but I think we're going to get to it in a couple of slides. Then when we get to freshwater, it's a little more straightforward. You got your lakes, you got your rivers, and then you got your wetlands, which again is kind of leaning over here. These are terrestrial slash, they're like the cocktail of it all. They're terrestrial, they're marine, and they're freshwater. And so they are really, it turns out, critical to human beings. These wetlands tend to provide vegetation offshore that actually can greatly slow storms, and that's are no longer there because we're damaging wetlands and making areas like coastal Louisiana more susceptible to storm damage. Okay, so we're going to start way out in the pelagic, the oceanic. Get stuff out of the way. Can't make that go away. Let's end it because I'm done with it. Okay, here we are going from, that's kind of blocked off, that says epipelagic, to the mesopelagic, to the bathypelagic, to the abyssopelagic, and to the hadopelagic. Those are seen right here, and it tells you approximately the depth. The epipelagic is the region that light penetrates, so 0 to 200 meters. You go any further than that, and it becomes dark, and that's kind of shown here. Talking here about the oceans and the seas, they can get very deep, up to 4,000 meters. We can do this horizontally. I just talked about going in terms of depth, but horizontally, it's the intertidal region, the neritic, which goes out to the continental shelf, and then everything beyond the continental shelf is the deep ocean. If we want to do that from top to bottom, we start at the epipelagic and then go to the meso, the bathy, the abyssal, and the hadal. The hadal are these little caves or crevices in the crust that are typically beyond 6,000 meters deep. Definitely some high pressure down there. A little terminology to help you. Benthic is any term that refers to being on the bottom of the ocean, whether it's 6,000 meters on the bottom of the ocean or 200 meters on the bottom of the ocean. If it lives on the bottom of the ocean, it's benthic. If it's pelagic, it's off the bottom of the ocean. You might hear pelagic birds, and that's think of seagulls that are living on the surface of the water or nesting. They might nest terrestrially, but they spend their time on the surface of the water, diving for fish, not living on the bottom of the ocean. Already talked about nutrient mixing and productivity. So we're going to have a slide on each one of these. We'll start at the surface, the epipelagic, or I prefer the term euphotic because that tells you it's about light. This is the zone of the ocean where there is enough light for photosynthesis and primary production to occur. Primary productivity is the fixation of energy by an autotroph. An autotroph is a plant. Oceanic plants are called phytoplankton. These are the organisms in the ocean that are fixing energy, that are capturing sunlight and fixing energy. We don't get that anywhere but the euphotic zone. So everything below that that has anything to eat is actually reliant on stuff dying and sinking. So lots of animals will come and go, but most of them, and certainly the primary producers, are restricted to the euphotic zone. So this is where most of the game is being played. It's certainly where humans have spent most of their time because it's hard to dive beyond 200 meters. And so that's where most life is concentrated, is in the euphotic. That would be a good quiz question. I'm going to lump the meso and the bathy because it's just deep. It's dark. There's not enough light for photosynthesis. Oxygen is concentration is very low. There's very little life here except for some consumers of dead organic material. We do increasingly, as we spend more time down there, as the technology improves, we start finding just insane organisms that are able to survive down there, either on dead organic matter or some crazy generation of chemical energy. It's certainly a new frontier. A lot of people would argue that we don't spend enough time understanding the deep ocean and the millions of species that we haven't, microbes that we haven't identified, spending a lot of money going to other planets, and we aren't spending nearly as much money understanding our own planet. And this would be an area that is under-researched for sure. The abyssopelagic is even worse. If you find an organism down there, it usually has no color. It's colorless. It has no reason to be able to see. If you've ever thought about that, but there's no ability to see anything, the natural selection is not really going to favor an organism that has a lot of retinal capacity. So blind, colorless organisms, but nevertheless, we don't know jack about it. It's very difficult to explore. We're doing better than this. We've progressed from that, but it is hard and expensive to get down there and study. The last zone is the hadopelagic. And it's just crazy deep. I told you it's in these trenches. The reason it's worth noting is that these trenches, while they're pretty unexplored, have been shown to be the representative of another kind of primary productivity. We're not going to talk about it much in this course because it's so restricted, but it is worth noting that some organisms have figured out how to live in the absence of plants. Chemoautotrophs. Troph means food. Auto means doing it yourself, right? So an autotroph makes their own food. So a plant is an autotroph, the primary producer. It makes its own food by capturing sunlight through photosynthesis. A chemoautotroph is somebody that makes their own food, but not through sunlight, not through photosynthesis, but instead deriving energy from chemical reactions, right? I'm not going to quiz you on this crazy diagram. It is a way of generating energy entirely from inorganic sources. So it is somewhat rare. It is somewhat bizarre. It's not the main source of energy, but it's actually postulated to be the way that opened the door for photosynthetic life. In other words, aerobic capacities and the ability to capture sunlight and have all of this energy probably is a derived state from our ancestors, not human ancestors, or at least not recent human ancestors, but organisms that are ancestral to photosynthetic autotrophs probably made their own energy from these inorganic sources. All right, so that is the deep ocean. We're going to switch from going down to going out. So we're switching to the horizontal, and we're going to talk about the neritic region, which is where there is most of the marine diversity. The habitats here are variable based on the temperature. We know that has a lot to do with latitude and substrate. What is the playing field like? Coral reefs are an example of the neritic, highly biodiverse areas. They tend to be closer to the tropics. They're similar to kelp forests, which are more temperate and subpolar. The coral reefs are closer to the equator. Kelp forests are further from the equator towards the poles. They're both very, very sensitive ecosystems. They're both heavily damaged by industry, by chemical variation. We put a lot of chemicals into the water. These coral reefs take up this water. I don't know if you've ever tried to go snorkeling at a coral reef, but they don't let you wear sunscreen. And for some of us, that's like a deal breaker. Like, I'll die out there. 3 hours floating in water without sunscreen on, I would be a mess. But the point and what they've found is that all of that sunscreen with all of those tourists actually adds to the chemistry, changes the chemistry, and is actually bad for coral reefs. So these are very sensitive ecosystems. They're very important in terms of biodiversity. I talked about how offshore ecosystems are beneficial in buffering the land from storms coming in. And they are definitely an ecosystem under threat. So they're an example of a boundary water. And these intertidal or regions where the sea meets the land are incredibly important for their boundary capacity, their ability to take wind, their ability to, we talked about how they can be very diverse because of the combination of marine and terrestrial dry land. They can be heavily affected by tides. Table shaking. They're very influenced by the chemicals and the physical tides. Salt marshes, estuaries, mangroves. These are not where sea meets land, but where sea meets river or floodplain. So this is marine hitting terrestrial. This is marine hitting fresh water, river or floodplain. Again, affected by tides and physical properties, incredibly productive, not as diverse because of the difficulty of living in both freshwater and saltwater. That tends to be something that an organism is good at one or the other of. And so the diversity of estuaries and salt marshes, the animal diversity especially, is quite limited. All right, I'm going to pull up there and finish with freshwater ecosystems next time. We will almost certainly have plenty of time then to transition into the fourth lecture, which is about a primer for individual ecology. We'll talk about how natural selection acts on individual phenotypes and changes genotypes. We will do that all next Tuesday, so have a good weekend.